Hey guys, I am here with Dan, Linux and arcade guru, Australian commenter in the YouTube. What's up, man?
Hey, I'm good, Bob. How are you?
Pretty good. So, a really good friend of mine's from Canberra, and he wanted me to make sure to do this because this is going to piss us all off. Let's start this one out correctly.
Terrible beers, the worst.
Yeah, it's really bad, but you know what?
Yep.
Fuck it, we're doing it.
Sure. I don't think you can even buy those here. I haven't seen them in a long time.
Yeah, he said he'd never really drank it until he moved to America, and his asshole American friends kept buying it for him. So.
We export it to you guys. We don't want it.
Fair enough. Hey, whatever. It's cheap and it's down the street for me. So
cool.
So, we've been going back and forth a bunch, and there's like a million questions I wanted to ask, but
Sure.
I guess I'll start with an easy one. Well, maybe easier one. I'm really liking the plug and play Raspberry Pi stuff. So it's obviously not even close to as powerful as a full PC, but I love the fact that you download these images, you load your ROMs, and you're good to go. At this point now, with the different Linux distros the way they are you able, or you meaning your average Windows or Mac person, is it at the point now where you're able to just install Linux on something and then load something like this, or is it still pretty complicated?
If you're talking like a Raspberry Pi device, they're getting pretty good. I see the different sort of distro and hardware guys all working towards a pretty plug-and-play solution. And like I watched a bit of your Mike Chi video last night, and he talks a bit about it too, about the sort of the goals of his project, where he's just trying to get everything where you can just download an image, whack it on the Pi, run it, and you're getting something that's pretty accurate. So I think they're all doing a good job. They're all kind of tackling it in slightly different ways, but the underlying tech that they're using in there is pretty similar, and I think they'll end up converging. I think you'll see sort of one way to do it coming through that'll make it easy for everyone.
Yeah, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah, and they're doing a really good job, and they're using the same sorts of ideas that are coming out of what I've seen out of the Linux PC emulation scene, where those guys are using sort of just-in-time mode line calculations to generate the mode lines to throw stuff at the screen. So obviously with a console that's heaps easier. With a console, you got a pretty fixed resolution group, but with arcade stuff, it gets a bit tricky, obviously.
Right. So for somebody with a PC, right? Are there any distros that are equally as easy to install as the Raspberry Pi stuff now, or do you have to go in and like install Ubuntu and install the software on top of that?
The easiest one is Groovy Arcade. So there's a guy, his username Calamity. He sits on the Build Your Own Arcade Control forums. It's a good place to chat to him there. So he makes two bits of software. So Groovy MAME is one and Groovy Arcade is the other. Groovy MAME is OS independent. So you can run it on Windows and you can use like the, what are those ATI hacked up drivers? CRT
Emudriver, right.
Yeah, that one. So you can use those. You can use soft 15 kilohertz. You can use that kind of stuff.
And that's what I was running on my old Mortal Kombat machine, was Groovy MAME on top of Windows Embedded. I think I did like 5 different images just to see what I could get out of it. But I just mean like from a Linux point of view, like, you download one of these Raspberry Pi ISOs basically, and then you just burn it to a SD card and you're done.
Yeah, so Groovy Arcade's similar to that. It's an ISO that you can download. You can either put it on a USB stick or on a disk. Install it. Very sort of straightforward to install. The wizard is sort of just off you go. You dump all your ROMs in a particular folder and you're ready to go. I guess the tricky bit is actually getting video out of it. So with a Raspberry Pi, obviously you can use like a hat, like one of Mike Chi's hats, or you can use like the GERT VGA 666, or you can use something like that to sort of get pretty simple standard sort of video signal out of it. With the PC route, you're obviously going down a little bit of an extra hop. So whether you're trying to use a sync combiner out of your VGA port and just get like a SCART level signal out to a TV, or whether you go with something like the Ultimarc Video Amp or the J-PAC hardware that those guys sell, and then that boosts all the signals to get it ready for an arcade monitor, because they've got high voltage input requirements. Arcade monitors sit at about think a SCART TV is about like 0.7 to 1 volt peak to peak, something like that. And arcade monitors are like sort of 3 to 4 volt peak to peak. So you can bang a bit of hardware in the middle there and then send that through to an arcade CRT. But, as far as sort of setting it up, they do a really good job of making it fairly simple. So you just kind of follow the wizard. You put in the rough specs of your monitor. There's probably 5 or 6 like popular arcade monitors. Like there's a couple of Wells Gardners, there's in there now, and there's a few other brands that float around. And they offer those in the wizard setup. Like they say, do you have one of these? If you say yes, then they'll pre-configure all the mode line limits to suit that monitor, which is pretty cool. You can even tell it that you've just got a regular, like North American NTSC TV or a PAL TV, and it'll configure it so that it'll sort of shrink lines to fit within those specs as well. Wow. So there's some technical limits to that, obviously. Like you're hard locked into your line count with those. So if you're changing line count and you sort of squish your picture a bit, your refresh rate is hard locked as well to 60 hertz. So, things like, you get some weird games out there like the Mortal Kombats and the NBA Jams and that kind of stuff. So they're like, whatever they are, 54.7 hertz refresh or something weird. So for a TV, that means, a few extra sort of slow down or buffer frames or whatever to get it perfectly synced, or using some sort of vertical sync delay, versus on an arcade monitor where you can get it spot on.
Yeah, so the last time I really dug into this, and I got into one of my obsessive projects. It was right when the website was first starting out, so I didn't have as much to do. But for my job, I used to design Windows embedded images, which is a gigantic pain in the ass, but you could pull out all the modules that you don't need. And when it comes to video, you're pretty much running a full Windows distro anyway, but I got it all locked down, and I used software called Mala just because everything was in a realm that I was incredibly comfortable with. Basically, imagine every time you launch, you run a DOS batch file, right? This is stuff I've been doing since I was a little kid. But, getting to the point where you're actually like, okay, this is what to do, was like a full weekend's worth of work. And then reproducing that on the same hardware was like a half hour. But then whenever I would change hardware, that's when a lot of these things would start to crop up. So those batch files where all you do is swap resolutions that would work flawlessly on one video card started to give crashes and weird stuff on other ones. Do you generally run into that with the Linux stuff, or is their driver base so wide now that it doesn't even matter?
Yeah, not really. The Linux, the way I guess Linux boots is a bit different to the way Windows boots. Windows 10 is different again. That's sort of, they've made some changes there to make it a bit more hardware agnostic, which is a good direction for Windows, I think. On Linux, very rarely do you get that problem, as long as you've got the same major family of something. So as long as you've got, like, I've even pulled hard drives out of Intel machines and stuck them in AMD machines, and they work fine. The big one is the video card. As long as it's the same family, as long as you're going from an ATI card to an ATI card, you're generally okay. As far as compatibility with the low res stuff, with the sort of 240p world that we're in, the AMD cards are the ATI chipset, AMD chipsets. They're the way to go for sure. There's the Calamity, who makes Groovy MAME, he maintains a post on one of his forums where he's got a lot of families of AMD cards that you can go through, and you can look at all the chipsets, and he's got caveats as to whether some of them have got a pclock, a pixel clock that can go low enough, so that determines in your 240p world the minimum width that you can handle. So if you think, from our point of view, 320 by 240 is sort of the window, and then you get things like a Super Nintendo sort of 256, so it's a little bit squished, and then we sort of squeeze it out to make non-square pixels. So, when your P clock can't go that low, that's when you run into those problems where you have to create like a really wide resolution and then squash it back down using your video controls. So he maintains that. So that's probably the only real caveat when it comes to hardware issues with the Linux kind of stuff. Otherwise, like, I've run it on all sorts of weird crap, mostly like old PCs that are no good for gaming or no good for desktop use anymore. They become perfect emulation boxes. And, I've probably 3 or 4 times now, like, I've got an old Cocktail cabinet out of frame there, and it's gone through maybe 4 motherboard upgrades in its life, and all random crap. It doesn't really matter. So the hard drive just gets yanked out of one, stuck in another, and it boots up, no problems.
So I've actually been on a lot of the forums that you mentioned, and I've seen Calamity's posts. Funny enough, though, I think the way my email address is forwarded, some forum softwares ignore it. So that's one of the ones where I've applied for a username there like 3 times, and then the first time it says check your email, and then I never get the email. And then every time I try to sign up again, it says like you've already signed up. So I don't know. They tried to fix this on the Nintendo Age. Yeah, arcade controls. Yeah. They tried to fix this on Nintendo Age. That did the same thing, and one of the mods there just ended up saying like even when he entered it manually, it got screwed up. I think it's because one of my servers is through GoDaddy or some crap like that.
Yeah, right. So. I do know the arcade controls forums are like they're running some ancient software, but I mean it's a really good group of people on that forum. They've got their monitor section has got a lot of old school CRT techs on there. So guys who come out of whether they've maintained gambling poker machines or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's all sort of CRT tech. So a lot of expertise there. That's probably where I learnt the bulk of my sort of actual hardware hands-on was from those folks, like teaching you, whether it's how to fix blown caps or transistors in the chassis of the CRTs, or just general CRT safety, how to get the right mode lines out, all that kind of stuff. There used to be a bit of software way back called Power Strip, which we all used.
I used to use that for years.
Yeah, so that was the thing that sort of started hey, can we actually get these signals out of PC hardware and turn them into something that arcade monitors can use? And then from there was the look at how Linux could do that. So we started hacking up drivers in things like SVGA lib, which is a bit of software that can talk direct to the frame buffer in Linux hardware, and then we moved on from there to X and what we do today with the hack drivers, which is how all of Groovy Arcade works. Same process.
Now you got me thinking. I have a computer at the office that's not being used. I'm going to throw an SSD and Groovy Arcade in there and see what I can do with it. Yeah,
see what you can do. So the install process is a bit interesting. Like I found it was easier to install on a PC monitor because you get that, you're booting into BIOS or UEFI of your PC, so you're getting that 31 kilohertz by default. Go through the process there, and then on next boot, it'll boot into a low-res mode, so you plug it then into an arcade monitor. But I think in the latest release, I've got the 2016 release on my machine, but I think in the 2017 release, they actually give you some option of failing back from one video mode to the other at install. I'm not sure. I have to check it out.
Interesting. So do these does this boot in 480p even for a little bit, or because that's the biggest advantage that I could think of to the arcade VGA is that once you've restarted after the first installation, everything is in 240p, so you don't have to worry about sending the wrong signal to your monitor.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways around that. So to answer your question directly, yes, because obviously your PC's BIOS or UEFI is hard-coded to send some sort of, greater than 31 kilohertz signal down the wire. So there's a couple of ways around that. The easiest one from a plug-and-play point of view is to buy Ultimarc's J-PAC. So that is it's a device that takes pure VGA signal in at one end and spits out to a jammer harness. So the jammer harness is that sort of fingerboard that plugs into most arcade machines. So you can either just pull RGB straight off that, like you can just solder to the pins, or if you've got a jammer harness in a real arcade machine, you can plug that in. So what that does is it's got a nice little hardware lockout. There's actually jumpers on the board that you can pick, and you can say what your monitor takes. So in arcade world, 15 kilohertz, 24 kilohertz, and 31 kilohertz are sort of the ranges that most of the monitors take. And it's just a jumper that you put on the board to say what your monitor can handle. So what happens is, say when you boot up and you're sending that 480p signal down the line, what you'll end up seeing is actually a doubled screen, but it'll be in 15 kilohertz. So just a sort of a weird signal manipulation. Looks a bit funny to the naked eye, but you're getting pure 15 kilohertz out. You won't damage your monitor or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So that's one option. The other option is to use something like an arcade VGA card. Obviously, like that's so same guy. That's the Ultimarc guy who does that. And he's on the arcade control forums as well. It's a good place to chat to him there if you can sign up. So the arcade VGA card has got the BIOS has been modified so that in boot it sends a 15 kilohertz signal down the wire, which is pretty cool. And it's totally compatible. Once you're in Linux land, when it comes to Groovy Arcade, the Linux drivers take over and sort of ignore what the card can or can't do anyway. So you're buying a fairly expensive card literally for 15 seconds of boot time, but it works, right? Like it's literal plug and play. And then your third option is
having the actual JAMA board built in is kind of a nice advantage because you just go right into whatever setup you're used to. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the third option is again, Calamity and his crew have got a bit of software called ATOM15, ATOM15, and that's a project where you can so you can plug in your it's mostly for ATI cards. So you plug in your ATI video card, you dump the BIOS to a file. You can then modify the file to tell it you're going to boot in 15 kilohertz mode, and you can flash it back to the card. So success rates on those are sort of here and there.
Now, are you literally talking about desoldering a chip from the card, or is this done just all in software?
Yeah, it's all done in software. So
that's awesome.
It's not super popular today. I haven't seen it for a while, but maybe say 10, 15 years ago, you used to be able to flash your video card BIOS just like you'd flash your PC BIOS with a BIOS update. Obviously when manufacturers make things, there's bugs in them or whatever, so they'd release these BIOS updates, and they do that for video cards too. I haven't really seen it in the last 10 years. It's something that's kind of disappeared. I don't know if they're making better BIOSes or they just don't like people flashing the video BIOSes. It's kind of safe to try too, because if you boot a machine with two cards, you've still got display and you can flash the other card back up the BIOS. So if you screw it up, you can put the original BIOS back on it.
I found boards with built-in video cards were very handy for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what was the name of the software again? I'm just getting ready to write this down.
ATOM15, ATOM15, and then the number 15.
15, all right.
Yeah. So I think that's maintained by Calamity & Co. It's on the same forums as I think it's the CRT Emudrivers as well. They're all in that part of the internet. So it looks like a cool thing. I haven't tried it yet. I really want to try it. I've got this machine behind me. It's got an ATI card in it, and then I've got another Neo Geo cabinet over there somewhere. It's got an ATI card in it too. So this one can't do low pclock, which is kind of interesting. I have to do the extra wide modes and then shrink it down. But the Neo Geo one can. But yeah, I would love to try ATOM15 on both of them and see how it goes. So at the moment, the power on this guy for the CRT is separate to the main board and all the internals. So I literally just fire up the internals, wait 30 seconds, and fire up the CRT. So it's manual and it's kind of clunky, but generally when it's on for hours and hours. It's not something I sort of fire up for 15 minutes at a time.
Yeah, so I used the J-PAC on my Mortal Kombat machine, but my cousin's got, everything I do, I make sure to build one for him, or vice versa, and he goes right into a PVM. And the main one that he's using is a BVM that doesn't support 480p, and there isn't a handy little device to put in the middle of it. So either using an arcade VGA or using a card that I could flash the BIOS would be perfect for his setup, because while the PVMs are like tanks, the BVMs are a little more sensitive. I highly doubt there's going to be any damage for about the 10-15 seconds of boot. But his practice is still to turn on his NES, set the input to that, turn on the arcade card, and then wait till he sees the hard drive light come on, and then turn off the NES and switch back just to make sure. So better safe than sorry with these things.
For sure. And, I've spoken to a lot of CRT techs over the years about this, and this question comes up a lot. And, the answer from them is always the same. Theoretically, yes, it could damage things. They've never seen one in practice. So these guys have seen tens of thousands of monitors across their careers. They've never seen in practice something go bad, but, you don't want to be the first one.
I would liken this, remember, this is a layman's opinion, but I would liken this to those flash cards. So, without a doubt, using an improper voltage flash card will lower the life of your system. But if that means your system was going to last 50 years and now it's going to last 49 years, 11 months, and 2 weeks, fuck it, why not?
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So now, when you've used some of the higher-end video cards, meaning in comparison to a Raspberry Pi or the arcade VGA, is there actually a noticeable performance difference? And I'm strictly speaking in the realm of arcade, certainly not Dolphin or any of the newer emulators that are out for consoles.
Yeah, well, I guess MAME itself, there's no hardware acceleration in MAME. So the goal, and I have to issue sort of a caveat and an apology to the MAME authors. I'm not speaking on their behalf. I love their project. Their project's amazing, but a lot of it sort of goes over my head. But the sort of, from what I've read over the years, the goal of MAME is accuracy. That's their primary goal, accuracy of emulation. I've heard one of the MAME authors once mention that playing games was a pleasant side effect of accurate emulation, which is kind of an interesting way to think about the project, right?
Oh, God, it's the story on my website.
Yeah. When they do hardware acceleration, they're always offloading from whatever instruction set they're trying to emulate to something else, and there's inaccuracies that crop up through drivers. We've seen over the years video card manufacturers sort of get dragged over the coals for cheating in their drivers to get frames per second up and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So they sort of, their focus was to ignore that path and to ignore the hardware accelerated world and just get into a pure software world. So when you're playing 2D is obviously 2D, but when you're playing a 3D game in MAME, so say you're firing up like a Sony ZN system, which is the arcade version of the first Sony PlayStation. All of that's being rendered in software. There's no hardware acceleration on that. So strictly when you talk about MAME, there's zero difference these days when it comes to video cards. Way back when, and I've been doing the emulation thing for a long time. So when we had the ISA video cards and we moved to PCI video cards, there was actually like a bus limitation there. So yes, a better card gave you better frames per second. But yeah, these days it makes zero difference from a MAME perspective again. But there's a lot of folks who love to do things like they'll build a multi-purpose cabinet and they'll put Street Fighter 4 in it as well and run that at 15 kilohertz modes, and in that case then absolutely go for a faster card. But the card that's in this thing is God, I don't know, I don't even know what it is, to be perfectly frank with you, but I don't think it could do any serious 3D at all. But yeah, who cares? Like, it's all for the purposes of that particular machine, it's all 2D processing through MAME, even for the 3D games. Mm-hmm. I don't care about the 3D performance.
Now, what about I'm just gonna stop for a minute. When you were mentioning going from ISA to PCI, I just had a flashback of how excited I was when I got a motherboard with a PCI video card. Look at the future that we're in. Yeah. Wow, it's my childhood. But now, what about Final Burn Alpha versus MAME? Have you done is that? I've honestly, the only time in my life I've ever used that is just in testing some of the Pi solutions. I've never actually gamed on it. Is it superior?
Look, it depends on what you want out of it. All the emulators have a different focus, right? And there's some interesting ones out there. I think his name is Byuu, B-Y-U-U. Yep. Mm-hmm. So he does Higan and BSNES and all that kind of stuff. His project's an interesting one because it kind of sums up the difference between MAME and Final Burn Alpha. So he's got a number of sort of, I guess, cores for his SNES emulators, and some of them take some shortcuts so that you get a nice fast emulation system, but you suffer on accuracy on certain things, right? There might be some graphical effects. It's often sound is the big one with the SNES emulators. They really suffer. And so he's got a nice high accuracy core that he offers for people, but you need a really kick-ass PC to run this thing because of all the stuff it's trying to do. And even he admits, there's still so much more to do because emulation of complex hardware, especially a lot of hardware in serial, becomes a very difficult thing to do. You're trying to do many, many, many operations per clock cycle, which is why we need such high clock speeds. So, MAME strives for accuracy, and they're not perfect, and nobody ever is, but I think they do an amazing job of really pushing to try and make it as accurate as possible. And they've frequently said, the MAME authors have frequently said that they really don't care about the frames per second. That's not their goal. They're not out to optimize something to give a better play performance. Accuracy is their first effort. And they've said quite a lot. If you jump on the MAME info pages and look at the forums there, you'll frequently get people whinging and bitching. I want these ROM sets and I want this and I want that. That's kind of the bad side to the emulation community. But you'll get folks there who complain about the speed of things, and the response is always the same. We don't care about the speed, right? Wait 10 years and you'll have a faster PC, and then you can play it then. That's their response.
And it's just the CPU speed that picks up the slack for that?
Yeah, yep. So they're anyway. Long answer to a short story. MAME guys are really going for that accuracy. That's their goal. So Final Burn Alpha is willing to compromise on a few bits of accuracy to get the speeds up. So that's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is what it is, right? So that one team are going for accuracy, one team are going for playability. So Final Burn Alpha tends to get used on these Pi images more often, simply because the Pis are quite slow by comparison. So I guess for me, the really interesting thing is, there will be a Raspberry Pi 4. The Raspberry Pi team have announced that, and they've said that that's a plan for them, and they're stretching that out. Like, they're going to wait 2 or 3 years till they do that. They're not interested in doing it anytime soon.
Right. It's going to be 64-bit. It's going to cover the massive change that needs to be made from, so it makes sense that it's at least another year away, I would think.
For sure. Yeah. And, remember too, that they're a not-for-profit, and they do a lot of charity work, and they're big on education. So they're proud of the retro gaming community that's kind of born out of their hardware. They really like that, and they celebrate that on their website. But that's not their focus. So, keeping a nice low-power system is sort of their focus, keeping it cheap and affordable for everyone. So when the Pi 4 does come out, that'll be an interesting jump. It'll be interesting to see. But at the same time, like, MAME is taking off. The development on MAME lately has been enormous. They've changed their license, and they've done a few other things to make it easier to code for, and they're getting a lot more contributions. And so, they've just gone gangbusters in recent years as far as the development of it. So it's kind of interesting that, as much as hardware is progressing along and getting faster and faster, MAME just keeps adding more and more stuff in, which tends to slow it down a bit. But that's not a terrible thing, right? I think it's a much better piece of software today than it's ever been in its life, as far as as quality code goes and what they're trying to achieve. So it's really interesting. And I've said before to you in email chats that one of the coolest things about MAME is that it's a walking, talking database. Like, you can dump out an XML file from MAME, and you can look through that XML file. And there's an enormous amount of information in MAME about the games. Like, not only checksums for individual ROMs, and I've actually seen guys who fix arcade boards for a living use MAME as a reference tool. So they'll dump real ROMs off real boards, CRC verify them against MAME to make sure that they're accurate. So MAME now becomes the gospel of, is this chip right or wrong? And then if it's wrong, they'll reflash them or find a replacement part or whatever. So that I've seen that used in that respect. MAME itself spits out the entire mode line of every single game that it's got from a video perspective. So that's how Groovy Arcade and Groovy MAME work. There's a little bit of software in the middle called switch reds. And what that does is it takes the output from MAME of what the actual mode line is that it expects, uses that to then compare against what your video card is capable of and what your monitor is capable of, and then generates a mode line that's sort of compatible between all three, and then off it goes. So as far as that goes, like, it's really good in that respect for documenting the video modes of every arcade board out there, and there's thousands of them, right? Like, arcade boards, because you can manually adjust an arcade monitor, you don't have like the broadcast standards that we have in TV world. So it gets pretty cool for that. But, like, MAME also does console emulation. A lot of people don't realize that. So there was a sister project to MAME called MES for ages, and now they've merged. Yeah, they've merged into UME, the Universal Machine Emulator. So, MAME inherently can do all our consoles that we do as well. To a fairly accurate standard. Again, you need much more powerful PC than you would some of the emulators we're used to using for actual play. But yeah, it's got all that information in there about the chips, about the video modes, all that kind of stuff, which is really cool.
So, just to clarify something though, when we were talking before about a faster video card won't gain you, won't gain you much more, if any, performance, faster CPUs definitely will.
Absolutely, and there's a great website maintained by, so I can't even remember the name of the project anymore. It's changed names a couple of times. There was like it used to be called MAME32. It was like the Windows, very basic GUI version of MAME. So I think the guy's name or his handle was John IV. I'm not sure if it's the same these days, but he maintained a website. And I used to too a long time ago. If you Google MAME benchmarking, you'll find my really, really out-of-date website. But John's is up to date. And he regularly benchmarks MAME on probably 4 or 5 generations of PCs. So he's a PC user and a PC enthusiast and a developer. And he usually buys some pretty kick-ass hardware. So he's got top-of-the-line CPUs, and then he trickles those down across his development studio, I guess. He sort of keeps 5 PCs on hand, as we all tend to do these days. And yeah, so he publishes benchmarks, and he picks a really intelligent range of games that represent a diverse range of hardware. So, he's not just picking popular games, he's actually picking games that are difficult to emulate, but, represent a particular chipset or combination of chipsets. And then he benchmarks those. And so he puts those on his website, and you can have a look at them, and you can see the generational jumps. And sometimes, for 9 cases out of 10, it's just pure clock speed is what you want out of MAME, right? You just want to be able to fit more instructions in that you can emulate and faster to just pump that out. Sometimes there'll be big architectural changes that really help. Like you'll see, when we went from the sort of the Core 2 to the Core i7 kind of generation, even though we went backwards in clock speed, there was quite a bit of boost when it came to that kind of stuff. And even then, like, the PC gamers always have their AMD versus Intel battles, and in the emulation space, that's a very different thing. And particular to MAME, I mean, the way MAME works, it's a database of emulated chips so that it glues together real time to emulate something, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, right? Like, a Z80 CPU, there's one of those in a Mega Drive, or Genesis, there's one of those in a Master System, there's one of those in 100 other things. Why not just emulate that once and then plug that in sequence with other things to make an emulator on the fly? And that's kind of how MAME works. So, it's interesting to see that, some CPUs do better at emulating certain chips, and some CPUs do better at emulating other chips. So that then has an effect on these sorts of things. So there's no sort of hard and fast answer. What's the best CPU for emulation? It really comes down to, what do you want to play? Go and find the best CPU for those games. And that John V's or John Ford's website has got a good list of sort of games that you can check out, and then you can sort of try and find out what CPU you want from there.
I'm leaving a note for that website, the benchmark website.
Yeah, cool.
I never would have thought of that. I never would have thought, an AMD processor would be better for some and Intel for others. But one thing I definitely can guarantee, unless there's some kind of weird software thing, I used to be heavily ingrained in the whole, I would get revisions of Intel processors, before they were even announced at CES or the Intel Developer Conference. Like 6 years of my life, I was just like in my dream nerd job. And the one thing that I can say is that once you get past the I series, like if you have an old, like 2 generations ago, right? Like 10 years, the Intel cores. I forgot the names of the AMDs. Regardless of which is which. So, AMD's better for this chip, Intel's better for that. Once you've jumped a generation or two, it's light years beyond what it was, the overall efficiency. So, I guess if we're talking about modern day PCs, which you could buy right now from Amazon, sure. But if you're talking, like a lot of the machines that a lot of my friends use for arcade stuff were 2 or 3 generations ago. So, definitely pay more attention. But, that's interesting.
Yeah, so MAME comes with its own built-in benchmark tool, which is handy. They used to sort of have to write this long command line to do it, but now there's just a flag that you can run to give you an idea. But, that's tricky too, because a lot of games have like a title screen or like a legal warning screen at the front. And the problem is that can happily run at 1,000 frames per second, and then as soon as you get into the game, you're running at 2, so your average is 500, right? So it's better to actually you can use the I think it's F12 and F11 keys in MAME while you're playing it to turn on and off CPU throttling and to display your frames per second. So usually find your favorite game, fire it up, see what you're getting. You kind of want like 150% as a nice, so if the game runs at 60 frames a second, you want to be seeing sort of 80 plus to be in that world of, you're confident it'll never dip below 60. You'll never get negative, frame drops or whatever.
Gotcha. So can we talk about ROMs for a second? Because one thing that I was always a little bit hazy on was that, I want to play Mortal Kombat 1, but there's the MAME 2003 ROM set. There's the FBA ROM set. Isn't it the same game? Isn't it the same boards being dumped to ROMs?
Yes and no. I mean, how do they get dumped is the question, and this starts to get into some real crazy, some pedantry around the accuracy of dumping things. All it takes is a single bit flip somewhere, and you've got an inaccurate ROM, right? And there's a lot of copy protection on these old boards. People put in, the developers and the engineers who built these sort of things put in all sorts of...
All right, I'm not sure. I'll take the blame for this one and say maybe it was my internet speed or something. Maybe we could blame your island.
Okay.
But
yep.
we were in the middle of talking about ROM sets and how
ROMs,
things get dumped.
Yeah, and ROM dumping. So, this is a world that I don't fully understand, but I guess I've watched it from a distance for a long time, and we've got some. There's a notable ROM dumper here in Australia. So I'm in Brisbane. I'm on the far right hand side of the country, and on the far left hand side there's a fellow whose nickname is Guru, and he does a lot of ROM dumping, a lot of rare stuff, or he's got a page you can donate to, so he can go and buy boards to dump them, and then he just hands them straight onto the emulation scene, which is really cool. He's got a lot of really specific hardware that he has either had to make or buy at great expense to do the ROM dumping, because every chip has got a different way to get into it. A lot of them have copy protection, a lot of them have suicide capabilities now, which is a real issue. And then on top of that, you've got even more complex ones where, I don't know if you've followed any of the decapping projects that are out there, where they actually use acid to burn the top of the chip off and then take electron microscope photos of the chip to find out what the hell's inside it. And that's like mind-blowing sort of stuff just to get a game.
Stories.
Me too. It's real, so cool. So yeah, as time goes on, you'll get a dump. They'll figure out that the dump's inaccurate, and they'll have to get another dump. So that's why you get revisions of things. MAME obviously is a moving target. So MAME 2003 is literally just someone took a snapshot of MAME in 2003 and compiled that up. So as far as MAME dev goes, there's MAME, which is today, now. That's the most accurate version, and it intends to get more accurate over time. I guess the thing is, as MAME gets bigger and bigger, and as it strives for accuracy, and as it emulates more of systems, right? A game might be perfectly playable with half its chips unemulated, and you might. I've heard you talk about this. If you play a real SNES and you play an emulated SNES, someone like you who's played it to death knows the difference, right? But for a casual sort of person, they don't really notice it. And so arcade stuff, unless you've played the board to death, often you don't notice it when you play MAME, the differences.
Yeah, I genuinely don't think I would notice anything unless there was variable lag. So if it's always 2 frames of lag, fine. But if it jumps around like on a flat screen, I would know that immediately. But the accuracies, no way. I don't know. Maybe Mortal Kombat 1, but that's the only arcade game that I've played enough. Right. But I don't think I would ever notice a difference.
Yeah, I a long time ago in a previous life, pre-children, I used to play sort of competitive level Street Fighter. So sort of Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter Hyper Fighting, that level era of Street Fighter. So for me, that's the big one. When I play Street Fighter on a MAME cabinet, I definitely feel the lag, definitely feel, a lot of those issues. But, again, to a casual person just wanting to have a bit of fun. And for me, playing something like Metal Slug, I was never I'm not good at it. I'm not, it's just a fun little game. So I can play that on an emulator and not really care.
Ton of fun, yeah.
So yeah. So anyway, as MAME goes on, the system requirements for MAME goes up because more stuff's being emulated, and it's being emulated to a higher degree of accuracy, so on and so forth. So what we tend to do is we tend to have these older versions of MAME lying around that are good for older hardware. So MAME for All is a popular project. MAME 2003 is another popular project. And that's why you see those on these Raspberry Pis, because back then, they did less, so therefore they ran a little bit faster. So they're a good compromise to say, this will play a few more games than that older version, but not quite as many as the newer version. But you're never going to be emulating some of the really recent, really high-end stuff on a Raspberry Pi anyway. So who cares? Why not get an older version of MAME and play some of the late '90s games that might squeeze onto a Pi if you're lucky? And that's kind of their philosophy.
So then by that, a lot of the ROMs might not actually be different. It's just part of a ROM set that's known to work on that group of hardware from that period of time.
Yeah. So if you want to verify ROMs, there's a cool tool called CLR MAME Pro. It's a Windows. Before, yeah, it's a Windows only tool, but I'm a Linux admin by trade, so I run Linux everywhere. But it runs under Wine under Linux perfectly. And so what you can do is I was talking about in MAME, you can dump out the XML file with all the information about things. So they call that a DAT file. It's a data file that contains all the information about ROMs. And you can either download DAT files. Some emulator developers actually just release the DAT file. So you don't even have to download the emulator. You can just download the DAT file to verify your ROM sets. And what you can do quite frequently is you can download an update version of a particular ROM set, use an older DAT file, and it will extract the ones that are still compatible into another set. So you can use tools like that to sort of build sets of ROMs for yourself, which is kind of cool. Like that's a neat way of dealing with that sort of generational of ROMs problem.
Gotcha. So this was neat for me because I just I knew a little bit of everything we just talked about, but now because we're having this conversation, it's all
gluing together.
Now I get it. Now that makes sense now.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I gotta say, because you're a Linux guy, I deal with people all the time, like Renee from DB Electronics, that are always trying to tell me that Linux is the end all be all and everything else is garbage. I'm a moron because I still do my admin stuff in Windows. From a gaming perspective, we'll keep it in that box because otherwise we could talk for hours. From a gaming perspective, how viable is Linux? Is it something that for other than emulation, do any of the is Steam on Linux yet?
Yeah, it is.
It's been according to the not too long, right? But only a couple of years, not nearly as long as on Windows. Or am I wrong about that?
No, you're correct. It's a difficult conversation to get into without getting really religious, which I don't want to do. So, looking at it, trying to be as pragmatic as possible about it and not get religious. I love Linux for a bunch of reasons around the freedom that it presents users in terms of they can do whatever the hell they want with their own system, right? Like you're not under control of somebody else to run your computer in a particular way. But that kind of gets nullified by if you don't care, then what's the problem? So as far as gaming goes, Linux, I think, is a perfectly capable system. There's quite a few arcade boards these days arcades these days in arcades aren't arcades anymore. They're PCs in a box, right? Like that's, Street Fighter 4, Street Fighter 5, they're all PCs in a box. So there's a few of those that run Linux, which is pretty interesting. As far as gaming with Steam goes, it's been on Linux for, I'm going to take a wild guess and say about 5 years. I've played through a number of games on Steam for Linux. And they're fine. Like the compatibility is high. Where they've put the effort in to make it a Linux build of the software, the compatibility is high. The frame rates are great. Valve did a lot of work with the various driver manufacturers to really improve it to the point where, for a handful of games, they were getting better frame rates out of Linux than out of Windows. My world, as far as Linux sysadmin goes, I work for a VFX company, so we do a lot of visual effects for film and TV and that kind of stuff. So a lot of the super high-end 3D applications all run on Linux anyway. That's the preferred platform for that industry. So it's kind of interesting when you're talking like super high-end 3D, you talk Linux. If you go down to sort of gamer level, it tends to become more Windows again, and so that's kind of an interesting view, I guess. But look, I think the other thing is momentum, right? Like Steam's been on Linux for 5 years-ish, and I think the latest Steam survey came out and said that 1% of all Steam users are Linux users. So, that's a huge kind of, I don't think you'll see people leaving Windows for Linux in droves anytime soon, unless Microsoft did something really, really dumb to annoy their user base, like ads in the start menu or something. I don't know.
Well, but money has a gigantic thing to do with it, because while Linux is free, right, if you're a huge corporation, or I guess even if you're just a small company, in the past 20 years you've invested all your resources in Windows, the upgrade to the next part of Windows is going to cost a nominal amount, whereas changing everything over, hiring Linux developers. I mean, my only beef with it was, I guess, mostly just laziness in that I'd have to relearn everything, but it is definitely when you, a lot of the jobs that I've had, my job was to make our stuff work with a pre-existing environment, which I had no choice. I could not use Mac, I could not use Linux, there was only Windows, so that was it, but it's interesting that you say the higher end for the VFX stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that just sounds pretty intriguing, actually.
So the company I work for is a small fish in a big pond, I guess. But if you talk about the really popular companies, if you talk about folks like Industrial Light and Magic, If you talk about people like DreamWorks, they're sort of in a bad spot at the moment. But if you talk about Weta, the folks who did like Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff over in New Zealand, all of those folks are primarily Linux, both at the server architecture point of view and at the workstation point of view. The reason we use it is more flexibility in our application pipeline. So we run, about 50 or so different applications from different vendors that form the pipeline for how we do particular things, how we build a particular sequence of images for a shot. But within those tools, we need to run maybe 6 or 7 different versions concurrently of those tools. And what we can do with Linux is we can install all this stuff on the network so the applications don't live on the devices that we actually run. And then we can write software wrappers around it to say, if you're in a particular part of a project and you call this tool, you end up with version 0.01 instead of 0.02. And it's all dynamic. The artists don't have to care about what they're running. They don't have to be tech savvy. And it's kind of interesting because our users are not tech savvy. Like they are artists first and foremost. They're very visual people. They're very creative people. And they're brilliant at what they do in their world. But they can't use computers.
And if we as nerds are doing our jobs good enough, they never need to think about the technical side. They just show up and be artists.
Exactly, yeah. So they just rock up. They point to, I want to work on that particular job, that particular shot, make Rocket go now, and they get the software that they need to do the shot that they need. So we put a lot more effort in customizing the interface, I guess, and customizing the way that they get to the tools. So, whereas I guess you could do the same in a Windows world, no doubt. Like you could put that effort in and develop that yourself. We find it easier because of the sort of inherent way that Linux, has tight shell to graphical integration. So we can do things very quickly in a shell scripting kind of world and turn that into a visual thing for the artists to use. So that's kind of why that industry has adopted those tools. And look, the cost is an issue too for us. We run big render farms, so we have hundreds and hundreds of machines that sit there just churning through 3D renders all day. Windows licensing on those, even at cheap levels, adds up.
Absolutely.
Linux saves us a bit of money there. So that's kind of part of it too.
It's so funny because so many of the things that you just mentioned were such a big part of the other things I did, like medical app where we knew a guy who designed something. So you have a hard drive, but it's really just there for other reasons. But you basically boot off the network and you pull everything right down Linux based. And, even things like talking about the way Linux uses the graphical interface. There was a buddy of mine worked for a company that did all in a gym, connected treadmills, I guess is a good way to visualize it. And one of the scripts that they were doing, somebody had written something in a software that ran through another software that had a GUI, back end, and he'd set everything up and he'd run, and it looked beautiful. It was everything, it was a great interface. The guy definitely had an eye for these things. And polling would come back something like 7 or 8 seconds later, which, when you're trying to do on-screen stuff, it was doable, but meh.
Yeah.
And then my friend came in and just wrote it all in C++, I think, and he just walked up with the command line, did this thing, and it was, 17 milliseconds back or something.
Yep.
You're like, see?
Yeah.
Skip all this extra shit, go right to the middle. And I think that's been a lot of the Linux development. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's interesting that I've seen it through a lot of the 3D applications, and it's difficult to objectively prove. But we get much better performance where an application comes to us from a vendor where they give us a Mac version, a Windows version, and a Linux version. Without doubt, the Linux version always performs better. And I couldn't tell you why. They might have put a lot more optimization into that. Who knows? But across the board, even the poorly optimized lines, we had a lot of tools from bigger vendors like Autodesk who would definitely have a Windows focus, and then they'll sort of spit out a Linux version off to the side, and that'll come to us and just perform way better than the Windows version. So for whatever reason, I don't know. But particularly in our industry too, render times will make or break a company. So if it's going to take us 100,000 hours to render something, and we've got so many computers that we can spread those renders over to try and bring that render time down. It can be a couple of seconds here or there per frame, remembering that when you're viewing a film, you're viewing 24 frames per second, that can add up to weeks of render time. So, even if we're shaving a couple of seconds off here and there, those optimizations, translate into, can we actually deliver the thing to our client as promised? Do we get paid on time? So that's a big deal for us.
Yeah, it's certainly a good way to think of things. Let me just pause for a moment, switching from shitty Australian beer to shitty American beer. There's no, there's no shitting on any one country. We're shitting on all of them today. I'll try to find some shitty beer from another country if I make it to another one.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. In this world, have you seen a lot of PVMs then, and a lot of the production monitors over your time?
Yeah, look, a bit of humble brag. I've got myself maybe 15 or 16 PVMs sitting in my shed as they were exiting the company that I was working for, and very graciously donated to me by the staff there. I pitched my case. I said, look, we can go through the pain of selling these on eBay or whatever. Ironically, this was before the eBay price hike. Like now, obviously, the stuff costs a fortune. Yeah. When I picked these up, like if you said CRT, people just went, that's garbage. Why would you want it? You wouldn't get $5 for them. So very fortunate. I got a bunch of 20-inch and a bunch of 14-inch PVMs, which is really, really nice. And I've paid that forwards a bit. I've given them to friends as well because I've got so many. I kind of feel pretty shitty just having them sit in a shed. I can only really use one at a time. So I've just given them to friends as gifts over the years, which is something I'm pretty happy to do. Awesome. I did miss out on a BVM though, but I'm kind of they held on to the BVM and then they sold it, and they sold it for quite a bit. And it went to a fellow, really nice guy actually. His name's he runs a YouTube channel called RGB Rob, believe it or not.
Yeah, I know Rob.
Yeah, really cool guy. And so he picked up a bunch of our stuff, and so we shipped all that down. So we're sort of up north, he's down south. We shipped it down to him. So he ended up with a BVM and a few other bits and pieces that we had.
At least a good place, though. He's a good guy. He does a lot of great CRT reviews on his channel.
Yeah, I love his channel. Like Curbside Collection's a big sort of source of CRTs around where I am. So I've got a fairly hefty collection myself, and the plan is to try and either I'm pretty lucky. Like I've got probably 10 or 15 of them already have RGB input, because we did have a little bit of SCART here, not as big as the Europeans, but it did sort of, if we got European models, because Australian manufacturing is pretty low and we don't have the population, so we just get everybody else's crap. We'll get some stuff from Singapore, some stuff from the US, some stuff from the UK, but because of our PAL standard, mostly the UK is where most of our stuff came in. I've got half a dozen or so tubes that all have SCART straight into them, which is kind of cool. Some of them are in bad shape and probably need a recap or something, but definitely keen to try a few RGB mods and a couple of them, see how they go. I do have 2 tubes that there's a guy in Perth, so again, other side of the country for me. J-PAC is the name of the company, and they're CRT repairers and specialists, and for a long time they were selling what they call the universal chassis, which is just the chassis itself. You take a couple of measurements of the back of the tube off the neck board, send them those measurements, they'll prepare a chassis for it and ship it to you, and you can just plug this thing in and literally turn any tube into an arcade monitor, which was really awesome. So the price sort of sat, I think he sold them for about somewhere between 150 to 200 Australian, so a little bit less for US dollars. But it was a brand new chassis, so it was like and quality controlled by people who are big on quality. Like J-PAC's got a real reputation for making sure his stuff is rock solid quality. So you're not getting like crappy components that are going to blow up in 5 years. You're getting solid components. And so for a lot of us here, that was a way of building RGB monitors, mostly for our arcade hobby, but, through an amplifier, you can get console stuff out and that kind of thing as well. So for a long time, I was running, back in the PlayStation 2 days, I was running all my PlayStation 2 gaming off an arcade CRT in pure RGB. So that was pretty cool.
That's killer. Yeah, I've seen a couple of transplants these days. Somebody, it was actually the Brooklyn Video Games guys.
I watched that. That was cool.
Yeah, he got a full stand-up Neo Geo. He had 2 of them, and one of them was just this. They tried to do a whole bunch of stuff to the CRT. I think they finally tried the Rejuvenator, and it was dead. Yep. Definitely, So they just happened to find a consumer TV that was the exact same shape, and I think it was the same tube, so it would bolted right into the same thing.
Yeah, cool.
So, yeah, and then Jose went directly to the neck board and everything, measured everything out, and they just had the tournament there, and these things are side by side, and you cannot tell the difference.
Yeah,
it's very cool.
Yeah, I saw both the transplant. I talked to Jose on Facebook about it. I saw his transplant, and I saw the tournament. It looked great. But I mean, the tubes are fairly generic. There's different manufacturers had different pin counts on the tubes, and ironically, Sony is a total pain in the ass. The arcade community hate Sony gear. They just loathe it because it's so custom, and really you can't swap bits and pieces. If you're in Sony's world, you're in Sony's world, and that's that. So you tend to get other brands are favored by the arcade guys, and they sort of reject the Sony gear because they can do these transplants. And yeah, more or less, I mean, a good quality consumer television that's not a PVM, and you said this exactly these words, I think, to Mike on your video. A good quality arcade monitor and a good quality TV are virtually the same thing from a tube point of view. The only thing that's different is the chassis driving it and the input voltages that they take. So the arcade voltage is obviously up a little bit. I think that's just to try and reduce interference. I'm guessing that's the idea. Like, if you pump extra volts in your input and you get a bit of noise inside the arcade machine, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to worry so much about shielding and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I've had a theory since the first time I learned about how you could RGB mod a TV, and it was that anything in the analog world can take interference. Anything, and it always adds a hair. Sometimes it's, literally imperceptible unless you have a scope. But I always wondered, does some of the chips on these TVs running through that circuit board and through their processing circuitry actually lower the quality of the image? Because at the end of the day, who was really caring in the late 80s, early 90s? And we just finished RGB modding a TV that has all the inputs. I haven't done the official pics yet, spoilers to everybody, but I could tell the difference between really high-end component and RGB. And my gut theory, I haven't tested it out yet, but I don't think I'm seeing the difference between component and RGB. I think I'm seeing the difference between running it through a consumer grade processing chain versus just directly into the tube.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, from a color space conversion, going from the YUV color space to the RGB color space is theoretically lossless at a math level, right? So that's that. But yeah, absolutely. Like, you don't know what quality components are in there, or, and it's always the same argument. If you're going to produce a million TVs and you can save $1 on each one, you've saved $1 million. So why not use the cheaper components? And for your average TV user at home, they don't notice. That's why we've had these component inputs for so long. Sorry, the composite inputs for so long was purely because people at home don't care, right? Like, that's, otherwise we'd have SCART on everything all the time, everywhere.
Yeah, and I certainly don't look at these things. Like, I certainly don't look at a one-chip SNES and go, oh, why didn't Super Nintendo or why didn't Nintendo do this? Like, I get it. Yeah. I'm really glad there's a lot of us out there that are willing to take the time to learn the differences. Yeah. And say, all right, cool. Well, here's where they used, 20% tolerance resistors. Let's switch them down to 1% and get this thing looking right. So.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, it's a bummer for people who aren't that technical or don't have services near them. Like, where I am in Australia, it can be hard to find people who do modding services for you. And we're physically the same size as the United States, but we've only got 22 million people, right? So if you're going to ship something, you're shipping it for miles and it costs a fortune. So it is a bummer. Our retro gaming scene here is definitely sort of exploding. Like, there's a lot more popularity in it. But yeah, there's so few people who are taking the time to do video mods just because it's too expensive. And I guess for most people, they just don't care. But it's a bit of a shame sometimes when you know that they're not getting the best experience out of it. But I get it here frequently. Like, so this is my arcade room, and around the corner is my console room. And so I'll host gaming nights and friends come over. And you'll get the folks who, they do have a few consoles at home themselves, and they'll ask, why does it look so different on your TV? How come everything here looks like it's so much clearer and the colors are better and blah, 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 blah. And you sort of explain the process, but they glaze over. It's just too hard for the average person, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, that's always that's always when I get my nerd hard on, for lack of a better thing. Is like, I had one of my wife's friends came over when I was still in Stanford, and she's like, hey, Lindsay says you have Duck Hunt. I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, I wheeled my monitor out. I was like, there you go.
Yeah.
And she's like, why does this look so much different? And I'm just like, oh, it's a thing. You don't want to be bothered. She's like, no, this looks amazing. It doesn't look like that at home. On my Wii, it doesn't look like that on my flat screen. Explain this to me. So I gave her like the 2-minute spiel, and she's like, I gotta get one of these things. So I'm like, sweet. Somebody that's not a nerd, that doesn't care, totally cares. They just didn't realize that they did. So.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Yeah, well, I guess, and again, like in the US, you're kind of lucky. Like you guys have got modders around you nearby that you can sort of call on, thanks to your population density. Yeah, here it's tricky. Although I guess you've also got dodgy modders. So
I was just going to say the population thing, like when you have more of anything, like everybody, a lot of my friends that live in the middle of nowhere are like, oh my God, are like people getting murdered around you all the time? You're in New York City. Isn't there like 1,000? Yeah. Like, well, but there's more of everything. There's also 1,000 more nice people walking around. So it's the same thing. Like, we have access to a lot of different modders, and it's just, holy crap, some of them are terrible,
Yeah,
it's just,
I get my guilty pleasure is watching anything that Voltar tears apart. I love that shit. I love it. He's one of my favorite humans. He's great.
When I first got to know him, I didn't know him that well. I just saw him on the forums, and I completely didn't get where he was coming from. I was like, does this guy just like take pleasure in fucking with people? And when they deserve it, yes, when they deserve it. But no, he genuinely enjoys helping, and and he's the first one to admit if he himself does something wrong. So now that I've gotten to know him, like I've never disliked him, but now that I see the way he approaches things, when he tears somebody apart, they deserve it because there's something really bad going on in there. Like some of those crack me up.
I don't think I've seen him tear anybody apart who didn't. Like he'll at least give people an opportunity to explain themselves, and if they tell him to fuck off, then he'll tell them to fuck off. So it's all pretty fair, I think.
yeah. You should see. God, I hope I'll have to ask him if it's okay to say this publicly, but he has shown me some of the emails that he gets from people.
Yeah.
And it's a little unnerving. Some of them are like, you seem like a really terrible person. Like, I'm just like, oh my God, really? He's like, yeah, do I go across this way? I'm like, no. I mean, I would love to fuck with you right now and say yes, but no, not a... Yeah, that cracks me up.
Yeah, no, I dig him. He's got a great ethic. I really like it.
Yeah, a lot of those guys too. They just all that matters to them is ones and zeros when it comes to criticism. So it's like I've been lucky enough for most of my life actually to be able to work with people that were way smarter than me, and I loved it. I loved just absorbing everything. And I've also been lucky enough to work with a bunch of people where if we're in front of a customer, they'd say something like, oh yeah, well, this is just a work in progress. And later on, they'll be like, hey, asshole, don't do that again. Like, people that show the trust and get your back and everything. So for me, it's a lot easier to deal with constructive criticism because I thrive off it. The more I get, the better. So.
Oh yeah, look, without trying to offend a huge amount of people, I think it's the sales focus versus the engineering focus, right? People who care about quality and incremental progress, regardless of feelings getting hurt. Like that's my scene. I prefer that too.
Yeah. So because you saw all those PVMs and BVMs come through, what do you guys use today?
So mostly OLEDs where we need color accuracy. So OLEDs are pretty interesting. They're not perfect. They've got their issues. When an OLED is new, and some of the good quality. So, Nanao was a brand that did a lot of CRTs. They did broadcast CRTs as well as consumer CRTs. They ended up getting bought out by a company called IZO. I think it's pronounced EIZO. Mm-hmm. So they make some high-end OLEDs, and they've got some really cool tech where, like, those probes that you can put over the top of your either CRT or OLED or whatever, and they measure the color and they give you feedback about the accuracy of your color, and then you can calibrate things based on those. They have one built into the strip around the outside of the monitor. So you can literally... Yeah, you can push a button. I mean, for this, you're paying, 35 to 40 grand for the monitor, but you can push a button and auto-calibrate your monitor, which is fantastic, right? Especially if your world is color. Like if you're someone who deals with what they call digital intermediate, which is the process of a film where you're doing color corrections, and it's everything from turning day into night to we've actually shot 3 different versions of a shoot across 3 days, and we just need to make it look consistent so it doesn't look like we're changing brightness and color all over the place to other things like, you know, setting the tone and setting the emotion of a scene, or if you're Michael Bay, making everything look sort of urine colored, right? Like, so they're all sorts of the themes that people want out of their film. So when that's your world, you need accurate color. You need to know what you're looking at is real. So we normally use probes for that, but yeah, some of these high-end monitors can self-calibrate, which is pretty cool. So OLED's got the color gamut; it's got the range of colors that we use, which is really cool. The downside to OLED is its half-life, so it's quite short. I think you can get like 24/7 use, which is, you know, a lot of these monitors are used for much greater than 8 hours a day. Like, these people work some crazy hours, so that the monitors are on for a long time. And after maybe say 5 years, the colors tend to go on them, and you can't do anything about it, unfortunately. I've also heard, and I don't know how accurate it is because I've never witnessed it myself, but I've heard that elderly people have problems interpreting color transmitted by OLED. There's a problem as you age with your color interpretation, and somehow the way that OLED transmits colors, it means that there's like a color shift perception in elderly people, so sort of 60 plus. So I don't know if that's a real thing or not. I'd really like to find out. I've heard it from a lot of people in the broadcast industry in different places, so that's a pretty interesting thing if it's real.
That is that's kind of fascinating to me too. And I have serious issue with colors. So I've taken the color blindness test a million times in my life because most of my friends don't believe me when I tell them. But you know how it's like the 15 circles and you read the numbers? I've consistently gotten 12 out of 15 wrong every time. But like in American football last year, they screwed up, and I guess on Thursdays they do these things where the teams wear stupid colors. I don't understand any of that, by the way. But I love football. I don't understand the color thing. But they were, people were calling me like, "Hey, you know, aren't you colorblind or something? Could you watch the game last night?" I'm like, "Oh, what are you talking about? I watched the whole thing. It looked fine." And people were doing Photoshop mock-ups of what other people saw, and it looked like they were literally wearing the same uniform.
Yeah,
so I guess technically I'm colorblind, but like I could see all the colors, but it affects me very different. I actually think that's why I could spot some of the sharpness things. I think maybe my brain's wired a little weird where like I can't tell the shades of color, but I could tell the sharpness on Link's nose in Zelda, but like...
Yeah.
So well, I'm fascinated because my OLED looks like I've never... I had a Luva TV that I had calibrated. They were going for like $5,000, and I got one for like $1,700 or something.
Oh wow!
And I loved it. And the next TVs I got after that, I had like one LCD and a plasma. Were good, but they weren't as good as that. And this OLED that I got, this is the first time where I'm like, this is the best TV I've ever had. Like nothing has come close.
So you know, there's a new standard now with the new UHD 4K standard, and I forget the ISO code for it, but so the new standard in television will be 10-bit color. So where we usually have 8-bit per channel, we now got 10-bit per channel, and that's I'm excited about that. I've always said resolutions of TVs, like once we got to HD, honestly, for me, I didn't see any benefit going to 4K. Maybe now that TVs are getting enormous, but you know, when you're sitting back across your living room from a TV, that's not really the issue. For me, the issue is a lot of media is compressed to hell and they use poor color. So I would rather see that effort go into good color and smarter compression techniques. So, you know, we've got H.265 now, which is great, and now we're starting to use 10-bit color. So I think media will look better pretty soon. You'll start to see the quality of what you see in a cinema at home, and that's pretty exciting from a cinema buff point of view. It's pretty cool. But yeah, you know, OLED handles that gamut a lot better. You get true blacks on OLED that you can't get on an LCD, which is kind of cool. And even on CRT, like depends on where you get the tube from. Some CRTs are gray instead of black, because it's just cheaper to do it that way. So yeah, the blacks are still, I mean, they're still no color instead of color, so they're technically, you know, from an emissions point of view, they're black, but because the screen itself is a bit gray, they tend to be off a bit. But
yeah, that was the thing. So I had the Panasonic GT25 plasma, professionally calibrated. It looked great. You know, it wasn't the best TV on the planet, but I was more than happy. But like, if I forgot to turn it off, and I would like, you know, go out to walk out in the middle of the night to pee or something, and I'd look over, and you could, you know, in a pitch black, your eyes are used to the dark, you could kind of see that, you know, it's a little gray. It's definitely on.
Yeah. Whereas, there's definitely some light coming.
Yeah, like the first time, like I think I watched Lego Batman or something, and in the opening scene, like, you know, it's like the credits, and then everything goes black, and there was a second of silence, and I went, did I sit on the remote and turn my TV off? It went black. So a couple of times I've left it on and I've walked right past it and did not even know it was on. So
we've got where I work, we've got a number of these color probes that we use for calibration, and some of them specify LCD only. They'll only calibrate LCD, and other ones will do everything: CRT, OLED, LCD, the works. And it's funny, if you accidentally stick the LCD probe onto an OLED screen when it goes through its, because you run a bit of software with it that displays a wide range of colors and it measures everything. As soon as it shows black, the probe just freaks out and goes, "You've turned your display off. Please turn your display back on." So that's kind of funny.
So the probes that you guys use, I saw a demo a couple of years ago. It was a company that had partnered with a few of the TV manufacturers, and I forgot to write down their name. Who knows? Maybe that was a one-off thing, but you would take their probes, you'd put the suction cups on your flat screens, and then you would plug it into the USB port, and you would go right into the menu, and once you plugged it into the USB port, an option would pop up, and you'd press a button. It would make sure the suction cups were aligned, and you'd walk away, come back 10 minutes later, and the full TV would be calibrated. Do you guys have auto-calibration stuff like that, or is a lot of it still manually eyeballed?
It depends on what we're doing. So if there's no vendor support, if that cycle of plug USB thing in and do Automagic stuff is there, then we have to do it manually. So what we'll get out of the probe is information on each channel and a graph usually. Like you'll get a color graph and it'll show you where your white point sits and all that kind of stuff. And then it's up to the operator to manually adjust the display to make sure everything's okay based on the information, and then probe, right? So it's quite a lengthy process. Yeah. The longer you probe the monitor, the better the information you get back to. So a 10-minute sort of calibration we call a quick calibration. A good quality calibration can take you half an hour or more to do well. So where we've got some high-end equipment and no USB feedback, so we're in our suites in our business that deals specifically with color, we tend to have, the operators who use these are industry veterans. Like, these guys know their stuff backwards. A lot of them have got an amazing eye themselves. Like, it's as much as their training and their experience, there's also a natural talent there. So these folks, we can just hand them the probe and say, "Merry Christmas," and off they go. A day later, they'll hand the probe back and go, "Thanks," and everything's calibrated. For the other side of the business, where it's more like the color accuracy is not, it's not an enormous thing. Like, it's not, when people are sort of doing 3D effects, like if someone's in charge of, I don't know, like we happen to get a lot of films where we set vampires on fire and they disintegrate. I don't know why. We just do. It's a thing that we've done a lot. So that sort of thing, those guys are doing simulations, and a lot of their stuff isn't even colored. It's just kind of like, just shaded model kind of stuff. So it's not super important that their monitors are mega accurate. But because they're just a PC desktop, we can take the calibration data that spits out a file, and we can tell the operating system to use that file. So the process is very simple. We just attach the probe, we let it run for 15 minutes or so, spits out a file to the desktop, and then the next time the operator fires up whatever tool they fire up, you'll see the colors on the screen actually change. You'll see it sort of flick, and then suddenly it's in the right color mode. And it's very noticeable. Like, you can have, even if you buy two monitors from the same vendor and put them side by side, you can see color differences on them sometimes. And then we'll calibrate them, and they'll come up much more accurately. And across the fleet, like if you look out across the studio, you'll see people who have calibrated and who haven't calibrated based on those differences. Very subtle. If you're seeing like a screen of like all one color, which is rare, but if you see those sorts of things, you can definitely tell.
That's awesome. So based on what you just said, there were two things that kind of made me smile. One is the people that just have the eye for this. There was one guy, I think his nickname is Tech. He was actually one of the competitors in the Street Fighter tournament. Right. I've seen him calibrate arcade monitors, and then I've seen it verified voltage-wise later, and he could do the color calibration by eye, and it's amazing. Perfect.
It's amazing to see people like that. There's a good friend of mine locally who does a lot of, arcade repairs, arcade sales, that kind of stuff. And he's amazing for it. We'll go, there's a few sort of retro arcades that have popped up in my town, which is great. Like, I'm loving it. I go visit them all the time. Even though I've got all this crap here at home, I love going out to these things. It reminds me of my childhood. So, we'll go, and he'll just walk around and he'll go, nah, just pointing at all these things, and just would detail straight off the bat with like 10 seconds of looking at a machine, what's wrong with it. He'll point out the convergence issues on something, on a moving image, right? And I just can't see it. And sure enough, you'll bring up a crosshatch and you'll bring up the color bars, and he is bang on the money every time. So he's just got a knack for it. Versus me, I'm hopeless. Like my white balance shifts so quickly. I'll watch something for a while and I think it's fine, and then I'll turn and look at something else and it looks all blue, and I'll go, oh no, that was actually out. I'm hopeless at noticing that. So
yeah, I could pull up the color bars and get it to the point where your average person won't walk in and go, like,
yeah,
that's the extent of my skills in this. So
yeah.
But the other thing that you said was, I get so many emails from people that say, hey, I like your channel. How come you haven't done a calibration video yet? Can't you just whip together a video about this? I got this monitor. Right. Can't you just... you guys have no idea to do it right. I mean, hours of sitting there in order to do this thing right. Phone Dork is one of the few people I know that sat there and hit every setting and to try to get it. And he knows the struggle. So.
And the problem too, like CRTs shift. They shift over time for a bunch of reasons. And even when you calibrate a monitor, the recommendation from any vendor is to have it running for sort of half an hour to an hour first before you even begin to try calibrating it, because it's going to even with LCDs, believe it or not, which I don't know if that's a leftover thing or if it's actual, but definitely OLEDs and definitely CRTs. You've got to leave them running to really sort of warm up to their fullest before you can even bother with that process. And then you give it 6 weeks and it's changed again for whatever reason. Like things have changed internally.
And when you used to calibrate CRT BVMs, I think in the US they said make sure the tube is facing east when you do the calibration for the magnetic fields and everything. And
absolutely.
One of my friends came over. He's got one of those 14K or whatever, the suction cup white balance thing. And he did mine and he goes, you want to see something crazy? I was like, yeah, what? And he's like, look at the screen. I'm like, white, and my stuff's all on rolling racks, and he just takes it and turns it, and then the lower right hand corner got purple. He was like, that's why I calibrated it sitting in front of where you'll be sitting for this.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's an important thing. I tell a lot of people use CRTs, like, and you get the degaussing coils as well. Like people will degauss something and then move it. It's like no, put it where it's going to go, and then do it all there.
Yeah, it's craziness. So you showed before we hit record, you got a Super Magic Wildcard, or
so I had a couple of these. I don't know if we can see this. If we'll pop it right
it's coming out great.
Yeah. So we've got this one's got a DSP chip in it. So I'll pull that out. So this is sort of like a half-height cartridge.
Okay.
And I have no idea what the thing on top is for. It's got like pins on top and pins on bottom. I have no idea. I don't know if it's just there's something else that's supposed to plug into the top. I mean, this is all out of the company that makes these Super Wildcards was called Bung Enterprises, which is the best name for a company I've ever heard.
Yep.
And they make a bunch of different things. They made an add-on that went on the bottom of the Nintendo 64 that allowed you to burn a CD full of ROMs, pop it in the drawer, and just load ROMs straight onto your Nintendo 64. There's a couple of videos on YouTube. I think they call it the 64 Doctor or something like that. Pretty interesting. But anyway...
On YouTube, not in person.
Yeah, same company. So before, I'll sort of explain how this works first. But so you've got a couple of different things. So in the side here, you've got a 3.5-inch floppy disk, right? And I've seen people switch these out. Those GoTech USB floppies? I've seen people switch those out, and they work fine. In the back, you've got a standard serial port. So it's a 25 pin, but it's just you can use like a null modem cable to a PC. You've got it wants sort of Genesis level input voltage just to drive the 12-volt motor of the floppy drive. It can drive it from the Super Nintendo itself, but sometimes you'll get resets because the power draw isn't enough. Sometimes you'll blow up your Super Nintendo. So always recommended to plug in external power. So the whole thing, I mean, it's really well made. It sort of fits molded. I'll try and pop it out. So the thing looks like this. Right, so that it's just got a cartridge slot in the bottom, and it just plugs straight into the Super Nintendo. And it's really well made, like it's really well molded, sits in there nicely. If I can get it back in. So the idea is you pop your original cartridge in here, and inside it's got a Super CIC chip, so you can play region-free stuff, which is really cool. Bypasses a lot of the lockout in a lot of games. So back in the day when the action replays didn't even do didn't allow. Also, this is a PAL Super Nintendo, by the way, for American folks with the ugly purple brick.
I liked our ugly purple brick.
I've got a Super Famicom, which I actually use more often for 60 hertz gaming to get the full speed out of it. But this was my console from when I was a kid, which is still around, which is kind of cool. So you pop your cartridge in the top. You then dump it to the unit. So the unit's got 32 megabit of RAM, 4 megabytes of RAM, and then optionally you can save it to disk. So it's kind of cool. You could take a 1.4 meg floppy, and they've got extra sectors on them for sort of safety if you get bad sectors on a floppy drive, and you can format the drive to 1.6 megabytes, which is kind of interesting, and then it'll even run on a Windows PC with some drivers, which is kind of mind-blowing. And then then the reverse could happen. Once you've got your game, you can whack the disk in and you can play it on this thing. This is like sort of late or early 90s flash cartridge, if you think about it. Like, this is what was around before Crix did his thing, which is kind of cool.
How long would it take to go from game to disc, or I guess you'd have to go from game to flash to disc and disc to flash to console,
so
right?
from cartridge to RAM on the unit was a couple of seconds, like not even worth your time half the time. It was like for the smaller games like Super Mario World, take like an instant. Writing out to floppy drive, that took a while. So you're waiting anywhere, say, between 30 and 90 seconds, depending on the size of the game, for a game to load from the device into the thing. So, it wasn't terrible. And it did like all your action replay codes and all that kind of stuff as well. It was great for homebrew. I ended up, through this process, I was actually, for a while, buying pre-release games out of Hong Kong. So someone was setting up a dodgy pirate shop in Hong Kong, and I was getting a lot of beta versions of games which I was playing. So I'm not sure. I've been chatting to the Unseen 64 guys, and I've been trying to see, like, take CRC measure calcs and show them screenshots to see whether or not I've got a couple of games that haven't been publicly released yet, and if they are, I'll send them to those guys and Frank Cifeldi and whoever else wants them, which is kind of cool. I just have to go through. I think I've got about a dozen that are totally, like, you fire up the game and there's no intro menu or anything. You just get to like a developer's menu, basically saying pick your level, and you go there and you sort of, half the graphics are missing and all sorts of stuff. So that was kind of a cool thing. Yeah, that's kind of cool. So before this one, I actually had another product called the Game Doctor, which is very similar, but the compatibility was a bit lower. So I sold that off and bought this Wildcard somewhere in the 90s. I can't remember when. Still got it, still going. It's a great tool, sort of to the point where you can use software to push over the serial port as well from a PC. So now I don't have to have everything loaded up on floppy disk. So I've never got around to buying a ROM card because I can still kind of use this thing. Like, it's a bit ugly, but it works well. Yeah,
you're not going to get MSU audio out of that thing. That's
Correct.
The one reason to get an SD to SNES that I absolutely love that thing. But that is pretty cool. Yeah. Did you buy that as a kid? Did you get, like, where you were older, bought it to use old games on it? Like, where did you discover?
Yeah, it was like I was 14, 15, and there was like a local, like, Trading Post newspaper thing, and there was an ad in the bottom corner of that. And it turns out there was a guy who was importing these from Hong Kong and just selling them through these sort of Trading Post newspapers. And it was a pretty hefty investment. I think that thing cost me about $400 or so. Like, that was a lot of washing dishes for a whole year to save up for that thing at that age, right? So, but it was great when I got it. And, like, I guess even back then, I mean, it's 100% piracy, but back then I just had no concept of what that even was. Like, it didn't even dawn on me what I was doing. It was just this tool for my games, and that's all I really wanted,
Yeah, and also back then, if you're individually ripping games, what dent are you really putting in the market?
Yeah.
It's not like today where if the PS4 is cracked and people start sending stuff out, developers getting paychecks today get hit really hard, whereas your floppy disks in the 90s are not.
Yeah, exactly. I think I ended up. I probably have about 100 games on floppy all up.
That's awesome.
But that's collecting over years, right? So I don't even know how many of those floppies are still good. I'm sure some of them are sort of rotted away over the years, but whatever. But yeah, these days, like I said, you can just push over software to it, which is kind of cool.
It was funny that what you described was identical in the U.S. The only place I knew how to get any of that stuff was, magazines where you'd have them in the back.
Yep.
And back then we couldn't. It's not like you could just jump on and Google the name of something and see if you got it. You would literally have to send a check for, I think it was $350 for those things, and then 6 to 8 weeks delivery. So you're waiting almost 3 months.
You didn't get ripped off. Yeah.
Right. So that's why Scott and I have been into this stuff since we met when we were like 9 years old or something.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason we didn't decide to pool our money together and get one of these, was for that exact reason. Like, well, how do we really know? But
yeah, well, I wasn't the guinea pig. I had a friend who bought one before me, and I went to his place, and I remember playing Super Metroid on it for the very first time, which was like, that was my favorite game ever from that moment, and just mind blowing at what a game could be, and that sort of sold me on, yes, I have to get one of these things, which is kind of cool. But yeah, funny you should mention magazines. Just sort of over there that you can't see, I've got, I don't know, I'm guessing 200 or 300 magazines from like the 80s and 90s that I'm trying to, they've been in I've neglected them over the years, and I've got a pretty broad range. I've got mostly UK magazines, which are pretty popular here because we've got the PAL gaming thing, but like a lot of, GamePro and EGM and that kind of stuff as well. So I noticed the My Life in Gaming guys do a read through every now and then. There's a couple other folks online who do read through. So I don't know if I have a crack at doing that, or I'd like to scan some of them maybe. So I don't know.
I think there's pretty good archives of Nintendo Power, but not many others, to be honest. So
yeah. So my favorite was a magazine called Mean Machines, which was a UK magazine, and it was just amazing what they did. It was one of their editors was a fella named Julian Rignall, I think is his name. I follow him on Twitter. He's still sort of around, and he still talks about the sort of stuff quite a bit. Really cool guy, and just a cracking magazine. And you can go to, I think it's just meanmachinesarchive.co.uk, and they've scanned all of them, so they're already out there. Anybody can read them, which is really, really cool. But I do have a handful of sort of obscure ones that I haven't seen online, so I wouldn't mind scanning those. I know Frank Cifaldi's huge on, he loves advertising from the 80s and 90s. That's sort of his thing. So if I find any like really obscure ads, I'll make sure I scan them and send them to him. There's a lot with like, very obvious sexual innuendo, which would not pass any censor today, but back then it was just hilarious to see this in print, right, in a kid's magazine. Yeah, pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, shit, man, this has been a blast. In fact, my only concern is how the hell, like, I want to share this with everybody. Could we think of a clickbaity title to call this interview? Is it like Bob interviews like Australian kangaroo murderer MAME expert? So we pick something crazy like that just to get people to click on it and realize we covered some really awesome ground tonight, actually.
It was a good chat. I don't know. Dingoes ate my Super Nintendo. How's that? You like that?
I'm writing it down. Dingoes ate my Super Nintendo. Perfect. Yeah, man. I don't. When it comes to that stuff, I'm never going to change the content and what I do. But I will title anything anybody wants.
Yeah. Yep.
I'll have to get one of my buddies to do like an illustration of like a dingo eating a Super Nintendo, and like you with a crocodile Dundee knife, because it's racist and hilarious at the same time.
Has to be stereotypical as all shit. Yep, get it.
Perfect. Yeah, well, thanks so much, man. Yeah, we've caught up on a lot of the things I really wanted to pick your brain about. I really hope other people got as much out of this as I did, and definitely gonna have you back on probably whenever I build my Linux rig a couple months from now.
Yeah, cool. Sweet. Cool. All right.
Thanks.
Good talking, man.
Talk to you soon.
No worries. See ya. Bye.